So it is my great pleasure to introduce Massimiliano Tomba. He's a professor in the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California at Santa Cruz. His work focuses on issues such as time and temporalities, Marxism, critical theory, as well as modern and contemporary political thought. So he's a kind of perfect interlocutor for the critical theory workshop and the types of discussions that we've been having over the last 3 weeks. He's published very widely on these topics and others, both in Italian and English, and perhaps even in other languages. I'll just note 2 of his publications that should definitely be on your radar. One is Marxist Temporalities, which was published originally in 2013. And then the second is the book that we're currently going to discuss, which is Insurgent Universality and Alternative Legacy of Modernity. So Massimiliano, for this discussion, I'd like to start out with a relatively general question that will give us a sense of where you're coming from and why you came to this project in the first place. And so the question is in 2 parts. One is, what is it in your own intellectual itinerary that brought you to this particular book project? And how did it emerge out of some of your earlier work, particularly that on questions of temporality, Marxist historiography, and other such things? And then secondly, I would be curious to hear you on why it was important to undertake this particular project that is cultivating and bringing to the fore an alternative history of modernity at this precise moment, right? Why is this intervention particularly timely or perhaps untimely? And what brought you to engage in it in this particular historical conjuncture that we're currently in?
Yes, thank you for your question, and hello everybody. Yeah, it's a great and difficult question. Actually, while I was working on Marx temporalities, I already started reading Ernst Bloch, Benjamin, and rereading Koselleck and conceptual history and all this kind of stuff. With some of them, I was very satisfied. With other people, I was a little bit not so happy. Why? Because I think in conceptual history, for example, there is a still, especially in the early Koselleck, there is still a fascination for the unilinear time. So when they start thinking and the history of a particular concept, they basically follow one possible trajectory and development that is very often based on big thinkers, how Hobbes thought about the state, how Locke thought about the state, and so on. And I was not satisfied with that. And then I started reading Bloch and Benjamin because they helped me to pluralize temporalities. And then at a certain point, I was stuck because I thought, okay, I have to understand what is time. And I started reading a lot of physics, biology, so scientific literature on time. And you know, it can be really fascinating, you know, quantum physics and this kind of stuff. But then I understood that what I was looking for was something very different. And I think it's not really possible to have an abstract understanding and conversation on time. So time has to be understood as a part of a category, or as a Kant would have called it, a form of our understanding of representation of reality, but something that is a part of a constellation. So time is always in relationship with other things. And I was interested in a political understanding of time. And for that reason, I moved from this kind of a more abstract investigation on time from concrete examples. Obviously, Marx was very helpful. This is the way Marx works. And this is, in my opinion, the way what we call historical materialism works, with the concrete historical examples. And that was at the origin of my project on the Insurgent Universality, in which basically I started with the chapter on the French Revolution, And I tried first to pluralize the concept of a revolution. So and my point was, there is not such a thing as a French Revolution, but there are many revolutions within the revolution. Basically, there are different temporalities: the poor, slaves, women, the black, as I said, yeah, and the peasants, and all these different temporalities are, in a certain way, they can conflict with each other. Sometimes they can merge. That was the case of women and the poor in the French Revolution in Paris, in the assemblies. Sometimes they conflict with each other. Peasants and enragés, unfortunately, didn't meet. But there was something that could make possible an encounter between them. So, and the point was, okay, what the French Revolution looks like from the perspective of all these different temporalities and perspectives. So in a certain way, what you gain is a provincial, or let's say, you can decentralize Paris. You can decentralize the Jacobin project. And geographically, you start looking at the French Revolution from the colonies. Politically, you start looking at the French Revolution from the perspective of all these subjects, which were not really excluded. They were actors, but in the dominant narrative, they were excluded. For example, I give you two examples, a little bit polemical maybe, but in any case, the well-known historian Furet wrote a dictionary of the French Revolution. There is no entry for the women, the black slaves. No entry. It's just totally ignored. Another example in political theory, take a look of Hannah Arendt's book on revolution. It is written as if the black slaves didn't exist. It is written as if the enragés were just a bunch of crazy radicals, I don't know, narrow-minded people. They were not. So, and by looking at the French Revolution from that perspective, I thought, okay, that makes possible for me to understand how or what an alternative canon looks like. And this is what in this book I called an alternative legacy of modernity. So it's a something else, a different kind of a history of canon that is not written from the perspective of the big thinkers, but from the perspective of the many actors of all these events. They are anonymous. The best example is the Paris Commune. There is no one single name that you can identify as the big leader. And they were aware and they were proud of it. So in a certain way, you know, instead of describing these events from one page of Rousseau or Robespierre, you start looking at the different documents, manifestos, declarations, which are the product of a collective mind. Usually, there is no one single author who wrote these things, but they are the result of discussion and compromises. And the last part of your question, yes, I thought that can be an intervention in our political present, because I think we can go back to this point because it's quite important. But I want to say only one thing. I think I can start here polemically again. When I was writing this book, there were many conferences on concepts. Concept of state, concept of violence, concept of rethinking democracy. and then I thought, okay, enough already. We don't need to fix concepts. We need different tools. We need, if we want to understand our present and try to make an intervention, we need different tools. We need to try to excavate from real events, practices, social and political practices, new concepts and categories. So instead of let's try to understand what is going on in Chiapas, Zapatistas, or in Cochabamba, Bolivia with our concepts, let's try to make an inversion and let's try to understand what kind of a theory can be excavated from these practices. What kind of a new concept we can gain if we read these practices with different glasses, with different lens. So that was my intention when I started writing this book.
No, that's fantastic. And you're right, we will come back to some of these politically topical issues, but just on that point, one thing I'd love to hear you more on is I really appreciated the way you frame your work in terms of really resolute materialism that is looking at practices on the ground instead of beginning with a kind of conceptual edifice or unified concepts and then seeing how they might be applied or manifest themselves differently, right? So it really is a bottom up, in a certain sense, materialist historiography. But at the same time, one of the reasons that I think your book is so important is that idealist theoretical work often criticizes materialists for being reductivist, determinist, simplistic, etc. And in particular regarding the question of temporality, right? That anyone who's Marxist thinks that there's a unilinear history that's developmental, that's heading towards a telos, and that's it. And one of the things that you do both methodologically and practically speaking is you embrace this really resolute materialist position, which is much more difficult. You have a lot more labor to do because you have to really understand practices on the ground. But at the same time, you develop this idea of a historical multiverse and multidimensional temporalities. And you demonstrate how these unilinear understandings of temporality are actually part of the colonial project and they're part of a political project. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more on how you understand this historical multiverse and how it is also a manifestation of a political struggle against these reductivist version of Marxisms, but also against the idea that you could collapse history into these singular threads or these simplistic narratives, if you will.
Yeah, good question. So the unilinear historical paradigm was the dominant one in, I would say, 19th century, 20th century. And okay, I want to be very direct. And unfortunately, it became dominant even for certain currents of Marxism. I'm saying unfortunately because that paradigm is the one that allows you to think in terms of progress and regression, to think that there are most developed forms of capitalism or political organization from which you can look at the different forms as a backwards or residual. And it's the same conceptual framework that you can find in a colonialist liberal like John Stuart Mill, when he writes first pages of On Liberty, that the most adequate political form of government for non-age population which are not mature enough to govern themselves, the best form of government is despotism, basically colonialism. But the idea is that there is a unilinear line and some people are not yet ready to govern themselves. It's the same idea you can find in the US attempt to export democracy. the assumption is that we have an achieved form of democracy that we can export because other people don't have it. So basically you reduce a qualitative difference into quantitative difference. This is how the unilinear conception of time works. So it's intrinsically colonial. You don't need to be evil to be a colonialist. You just need to apply a unilinear conception of time. Then the late Marx, in dialogue with the Russian populists, he changed his mind for many reasons. I think he read Chernyshevsky, he read different things, he read a lot of history. So, and basically when Vera Zasulich asked him, what do you think of the Russian Marxists who believe that the община, the village commune, is a relic, is a residual, is something that we have to destroy in order to establish a new form of production? And Marx basically answered, no, you don't need to get rid of the peasants' commune, but actually you can use this form of self-government and communal possession in order to jump directly into socialism. And then this is the interesting thing, he gave a different image of historical time. And he said, you have to think in terms of geology, with the layers, and not just with a unilinear time. Now you can find this idea of history as a historical layers, and the image of the geological image of layers in different thinkers, not so many, but in different thinkers. So on the one hand, I would put Koselleck and Fryer. The late Koselleck used the same image of layers. And Fryer was a very conservative German political theorist, but he was very explicit about that. History has not to be understood in terms of stages, but in terms of layers. So you have a conservative attempt to read history in terms of a layer. Why? Basically because of their opposition to the concept of progress. But it's something interesting. You know, I always think we should read the conservative. There is something to learn from them. And then you have other people who developed Marx's idea of these layers. And I would cite Ernst Bloch. Bloch ideas of multiversum. And first he applied that idea in the 30s in order to understand the National Socialism. Is an article on synchronicity of the non-synchronic synchronism, and is a brilliant article if you want to understand how discrepancy and friction between social strata and temporal strata can lead to fascism. And I think it's an article that has to be read today in order to understand populism. And then he went back to that idea and he developed that idea in the 50s when he tried to understand colonialism and socialism as a project that has to combine different forms of production, different forms of development, and even different cultures. Bloch was never a cultural relativist, but he understood that we need a different conception of time if we want to be fair with a different population, and if we want to try to combine that into a unique project that is, for Bloch, was the project of a socialism. And but in a way that is extremely respectful of the difference of time and temporalities that we can find at the level of our planet in terms of economy, politics, culture, and so on. So I think is an image that is a kind of a background tradition, this idea of the temporal strata that you can find in the 20th century. That idea challenged the unilinear history, and I think is quite important today, because in our, you can call it however you want, it can be post-colonial world or uneven development. So there are many ways to put it. But I think in our present is extremely important to understand how the friction between a kind of a dominant temporality that tries to synchronize the entire planet, capitalism, the state project, today is in conflict with so many different temporalities and other strata, which not only try to resist, but they try to recombine juridical, political, and economical material in a new way. That is a kind of a way out from the dominant trajectory of a capitalism and state. An example for all is Cochabamba 2000, when they say, what we are practicing is neither private property nor state property, but something else, social property. It is based on uses, customs, the way indigenous population related to land. It's not romantic. It's not a going back and try to recover an old form. It's always a reconfiguration of a tradition into the present. Is more a game with the times. There is no, the idea that you can go back and resuscitate an old form is still stuck in the unilinear time. And then you go back and you take something from the past. There is not such a thing as a going back. If you think in terms of layers, you just activate different strata and reconfigure the present in a new way.
No, that's very helpful. It strikes me that one way of making sense of part of your contribution is that you push back on the idea that there would be time as a kind of universal backdrop for human experience, and instead recognize that temporality is socially constructed and that there are different temporalities, and therefore that the friction and battles between these temporalities themselves are the sites of political and social conflicts. And therefore, we should not take it as a foregone conclusion that there's just one time, because as you just said, that one time is the dominant temporality of capitalist state formation in the modern colonial project. What I'd like to ask you about is one of the other really powerful aspects of this book is that you're not only focused on temporality, but also on geography. And it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, that this operates almost more at a practical level than a fully theorized level, in the sense that every single materialist history that you give us is demonstrating how you can't make sense of the French or Haitian revolutions unless you see the ways in which there's a transnational history such that these are always intersecting, and the nation-state centric geographic paradigm is insufficient. You do the same thing with the Paris Commune and uprisings in North Africa. Every single one of the chapters is showing intersecting geographies. But it does strike me that this aspect of your work might be slightly less theorized than the historiographical aspects that you've highlighted. So I'd be curious, in your perspective now, looking back on the book, how is it that you would theoretically cull from all of the work that you've done on multiple spatialities, if you will, and tease out maybe some of the core conceptual moves that you're making and that you have made regarding temporality? And feel free to push back if you think that that's a mischaracterization.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So let me say only one thing. I want to go back to the question of time. So I don't want to be misunderstood. When I say there are many temporal, you say that you got absolutely my point. When I say there are many different temporalities, I always say yes, but there is a one dominant temporality. So the difference between what I'm doing and the kind of a postmodernist approach on times is, I simplify a little bit. In a postmodernist approach of times, these temporalities are basically equals and reciprocally indifferent to each other. So you can choose whatever you want. My understanding is no, there is always one dominant synchronizing temporalities. And this is the origin of conflict and tension. So in capitalism is what Marx would have called socially necessary labor time. In politics is the juridical and the state. The legal system is a powerful mechanism of a synchronization. And then you have these tensions. So temporalities have to be understood in relationship to a dominant one. This is always what I try to do. On geography and space, you know, Gabriel, this is something that actually I learned when I read your review, because I was not aware that I was doing such a job on space and geography. I think it was a kind of a side effect of my work. And then when I read your review, I thought, oh wow, this is interesting. So there is a geographical dimension that is underdeveloped in the book, but
well, it's actually overdeveloped because you practically do it.
Yeah.
Really surprising and interesting ways, but it doesn't seem like it's fully rendered theoretical like the work on temporality is.
Yeah, exactly, correct.
It's all
exactly.
there.
Yeah, 100% correct. And I think it's a, you know, in that book, and I was aware of that, I try to challenge many political, juridical, economical binary opposition. As I said, I look at Cochabamba, it's not in the book, it's not in this book, but now I'm working on Cochabamba water war, and I'm interested in the fact that they challenge the binary opposition, state, private property, and they go somewhere else. Now, if we think in terms of space, what is interesting is that actually in these experiments, the binary opposition, the binary local national is challenged. So for example, the Commune or even the French Revolution, so you have this trajectory that is the national one. And I would say that was the Jacobin project, a project that the Jacobins share with the Girondins, even if politically they were on different sides, but their theoretical, juridical, and political project was the same. So that was the state project. So then it's very easy to think, okay, what is the opposite of a state project? If you don't want to scale up to the state or to cosmopolitan project, you just scale down and you have the local. And you start thinking in terms of villages, neighborhoods, and so on. And but this is not actually what happened. The practice of these communards, and even I think explicitly the practice of the Soviets during the Russian Revolution, was something else that I would call translocal. So for them, this local form of organization, Soviets or assemblies or associations, they were just a part of a different network that can go beyond the state. Because the state, when was not directly challenged, the state or the central power became just one unit among different units. Let me explain this image. So there is one way to think of the state as the unity which comprehends everything, which comprehends every single local form of government. Is the unity that comprehends all units. And very often the cosmopolitan projects go in that way. They just scale up the juridical structure of the state, and they are looking for a big international power. There is another way to think that is, as I say, this is so clear if you read what was done in Russia and in the Paris Commune. And the other way to go is to think that if there is a kind of a central power that in a certain way has to manage this plurality of units, this power has to be understood as one unit among units. So that power is not limited by mechanism of check and balance. Is not limited by constitutional mechanism. Is limited by the fact that there are other powers around. And this is the thing. People say, when I say that, sometimes people say and accuse me to different things. Sometimes they accuse me to be very close to the right-wing Republicans and the libertarians because I want to get rid of the state and then have all these local forms of self-government with power and maybe with gangs. Other times they say, okay, but then you have a conflict. If you don't have a centralized state and you have so many units with the power around, then you have a conflict. Okay, to the first accusation, I just say, okay, the point is that in my agenda and in the agenda of these activists that I consider in my book, you have a real challenge to private property. I don't think this is in the agenda of the Republicans. But the other point is, yes, conflict can be an issue when you have a different unit with power. But I would say maybe we should think conflict as a category of politics. Whereas the modern political project from Thomas Hobbes is to neutralize conflict. And the price we are paying for the neutralization of conflict is basically a state in opposition to a depoliticized society, a state with a monopoly of power, a state that can declare the state of exception and can limit freedom. This is the kind of a price that we pay for a mechanism whose goal is neutralization of conflict. I have some historical examples. So I can give you just one, very short. So that happened in the Paris Commune. At a certain point, they were discussing about limitation of the working day, and there were two different positions. So some people say, okay, we have the control of the city. I think we should just legislate what is a working day, how long should be the working day, and if people should work in the night or not, with the power of the state. And other people, they were more radical actually. They said, no, we don't need any state intervention. We know that now our working class, the working class in Paris, is strong enough to defend and impose their own interest. Let them fight if it is necessary, or let them find a compromise and to define what is a working day or how long should be a working day. So basically you have some dynamism that is based on conflict, and the self-regulation of conflict is a very difficult issue. I think we should learn how a regulation, self-regulation of conflict can work. And it's very difficult. So for that reason, I think all these experiments are a kind of a experiment in political self-education. It's not just, oh, we have to invent a new institution. No, it's a process of a political self-education. How you deal with the conflict without the constant intervention of the state. So clear in the Zapatistas' experience. They are extremely aware that their political project is a kind of a self-education in new forms of a togetherness.
You know, Max, this leads to a larger question, or kind of circling back to where we started, and that is the political stakes of your project. Because while I definitely agree with the characterization of some of the criticisms that you said you've encountered, it seems that those are criticisms that mainly, the last criticism, not that you'd be a Republican, I'm not really worried about that. The question of the state seems to be really about the question of the bourgeois state, right? Because the role of the bourgeois state is to pretend, basically is to ensure capitalist social relations while mitigating in various ways visible class conflict, so it can create a kind of false unity. But one of the tensions that I see in your work, and I'd love to hear more about, is that what you seem to be calling for is a kind of Marxist autonomism that might bleed into a certain forms of either anarchism or communal modes of organizing or indigenous modes of organizing that are really recalcitrant to the state formation. And for me, that raises the issue of, I understand recalcitrance to the bourgeois state formation, of course. But if you look historically at the projects that have sought to seize state power in order to crush the bourgeois state, but to harness its power in order to fight off imperialist forces from abroad and further class struggle internally in order to develop as much as possible more egalitarian socioeconomic relations, it does strike me that there's an understanding of the state that would be used tactically, but not strategically, right? The goal of Marxist-Leninism is not to establish a state and maintain it. The goal is to seize state power, crush the bourgeois state apparatus, replace it by a worker state, and then eventually dissolve the state. And that project seems to me to have been more successful in its historical gains, insofar as one of the other risks of certain forms of autonomism is what some people call left populism, right? That movements from below are fantastic and wonderful and should be celebrated until they actually seize state power, and then we should criticize them because they had to make compromises in order to get there, instead of recognizing that compromises are tactical and they're inscribed within the system of transformation that is integral to getting us out of a world system that is unbelievably powerful. So I'd love to hear you a little bit more on the Marxist-Leninist critique of autonomism, in short, if we can put it in those terms.
Yeah. Okay, no, I think my way to go is, I like to answer theoretical questions with the historical examples, and the other way around, historical question with the theory. In Russia, for example, so in the first constitution, the 1918, so that constitution is an attempt to formalize or to describe in juridical language what was going on in Russia right after the revolution. Things like, for a few months, each Soviet could declare itself an independent republic. Okay, so you have to think, it's almost crazy to think about that. You know, it's like a neighborhood, a small town, a school. So a local Soviet can declare itself independent republic. And Lenin was okay with that for a while. Citizenship. Each local Soviet has the right and the power to confer Russian citizenship. So you go to Russia, you go to a local Soviet, and you say, look, I want to become a Russian citizen. It's done, okay? The only assumption is that you are a worker, so you are not a bourgeois. So you don't exploit other people to live. This is the only assumption. So these two things are sufficient to think that politically, you have something that cannot be contained in the Western idea of a constitution. If you try to introduce this thing into your state, the result is the state explodes, cannot tolerate this idea of a citizenship, cannot tolerate this disintegration of its unity in this plurality of units, Soviets. So that constitution, for that reason, there were political theorists and historical historians that right after the revolution, they said the first Russian, the 1918 Russian constitution is theoretically, formally, is not a constitution. It's a kind of mess, and the state is not a state. So they're not building a state. And obviously from the perspective of bourgeois Western theorists, it was a kind of a reactivation of feudalism and something extremely backwards, in which the legislative and the executive power are not really distinguished, in which there is not really definition of what is the power of these local Soviets. It was, for them, was a mess. And with actually a medieval institution that was the right to recall representatives, that was called imperative mandate. So each local Soviet can recall representatives. Huge power. And as I said, they didn't need a mechanism of a check and balance because all these Soviets could limit the power of Moscow, the central power. This is the framework. Now the question is, how is possible that the 1936 constitution, the Stalinist constitution, is so similar to a Western constitution? If you read that constitution and you read the constitution of Italy or Germany or France, you find so many similarities. So basically, Russia was going back into the normative track of the Western legal tradition. Why? That was my question. For many years, I thought, okay, it's just because, sorry for the simplification, because Stalin is the bad guy. And, you know, it's a kind of an easy answer, you know, and at a certain point, I was not satisfied with that answer. So it cannot be just because Stalin is a bad guy. But I think it's because when you start centralizing power, when you start thinking in terms of this power, the power in Moscow, the power of the state, represents the entire population of Russia, then you are slowly introducing Western categories. in which you have to produce this Russian population as a nation, in which the power that represents the entire Russian people is the power that can always limit any kind of a local unit, any kind of a local authority. Why? Because it can do it in the name of the totality. So the new categories that you have is totality versus partiality. You can take a look at Rousseau, and Rousseau says the totality, what he calls the general will, is the real will. And any particular interest is wrong when it is in opposition to the general will. So basically you have a mechanism in which you subsume particularities into the totality, and you have a power that acts in the name of totality and can make a decision in the name of totality. If you have an opposition, it's no longer a real opposition because it's just a position of a part against the totality, but the totality can claim to be the totality and therefore can even claim to include the part, even if the part is in disagreement with the totality. This is the juridical mechanism that basically makes impossible the right to resist in a modern Western constitution. It's this idea of totality. Russia, for many reasons, political, historical reasons, civil war, the war, they were attacked, but Russia went back into that track. And even because, and that was another problem that is related to our first conversation, that is the conversation on time, because they thought we have to catch up with the West, economically and politically. So they had a problem to accelerate, to speed up economy, capitalist accumulation, and to synchronize the country that in their view was a mess, in which you have forms of a capitalism, a pre-capitalism, a feudalism, communal possession. You have all these different things. The point is that even you learn how to deal with these different temporalities, or you try to synchronize these temporalities. Why? Because your task is to catch up with the West. And I think that was the first big, I don't know if I can call it a mistake or whatever. So, but in any case, that is what happened in Russia pretty soon. And when they tried to catch up with the West, they started this process of synchronization, political and economical synchronization. They import the Fordism from the US. And that was the beginning of the story that, in my opinion, led to the 1936 Constitution. That is a pretty Western-oriented constitution. So it was not the product of Stalin's mind. It was the result of a process, of a different trajectory. This is what I think.
Well, we're going to open up for Stack here in a second, but in the interest of polemicizing, let me ask one final question. And I think the best way of phrasing this would be to try to pit Massimiliano the materialist against Massimiliano the idealist, because it strikes me that it might actually be a fight that's being hashed out in your own mind, if I can, for the sake of conversation, psychologize you. And that is that the explanation that you just gave, right, the historical record that you outlined is of course absolutely true. There was a process of centralization and a massive investment in a productivist economy of catching up, right? So that is historically true. But then you ask, well, why is that the case? And it strikes me that the response that you gave to that was an idealist response in the following sense, that, well, there's this idea of a centralized state apparatus, there's an idea of the kind of Western category of state formation and centralization, and the Soviet Union just kind of fell back into, or were lulled back into, that bad idea. I think that Massimiliano the materialist, or I would like to encourage Massimiliano the materialist to consider a different explanation of why that happened. And that would be all of the forces of capitalist imperialism that were unleashed on a state, or I'm sorry, a project that sought to seize and then decentralize power in all of the ways that you mentioned, and many more, because it was the most radical revolution for women in the history of the world, according to many, many evaluations. And that what Lenin, Stalin, and other Russian leaders were doing is that they were responding to the intervention of 14 imperialist states for a 2-year war that reduced their landmass by something like 80%. I mean, in 1920, it was likely that the imperialist forces were going to march on Moscow. If they were to sit in that situation and say, well, we believe in decentralization, all power to the Soviets, any republic can be liberated from the Soviet Union, etc., then they would have been crushed. And so it strikes me that a materialist response would be more appropriate. And actually, maybe to just finally say, one of the risks that I see in certain forms of Marxist autonomism is that what they agree with Marxist-Leninists on is the point we need to get to, which would be Z in the alphabet, right? A stateless, decentralized, anti-capitalist, egalitarian society, as you yourself advocate for. But to get there, when there are experiments like the Soviet Union that get to point C or point D, or wherever you want to put it in the alphabet, people cry foul and say, well, wait a minute, it was supposed to be decentralized. The point is that historically, we have only ever had socialism under siege by imperialist forces that's trying to birth a counter-hegemonic project within a world system that is capitalist. And so I think we need to distinguish between the tactical decisions that are made and the end strategy, which is ultimately shared between Marxist-Leninists and autonomists. So I'd be curious your thoughts on that. And then if people want to start putting their hands up and stack, by all means do.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. is a good point. Is a good question. Okay. Let me put it this way. Yes. There was they were responding to an imperialist attack. The First World War was not over when the revolution began, and then the imperialist forces continue attacking Russia. Then there was something. Maybe there was an internal conflict that maybe, I don't know. I don't like my way to write history is not with the if. I don't like to write history with the, oh, what if. Yeah, this is not the point. But the civil war, the internal civil war, was in part the responsibility of the Bolsheviks' politics, because there were two ways to go with the peasants. The SR said, look, the language of the peasants is something that is very compatible with the socialization of a property, in which we just let them deal with the communal possession as they are able to do it, and as they did for centuries. And that was the idea of a socialization of property. The Bolsheviks agreed for a while, and then they changed their project, and they introduced another category that was nationalization of property. What happened? It happened that basically the peasants couldn't even understand the language of the Bolsheviks, because the language taught the land doesn't belong to anybody. And if you want, maybe the land belongs to God, but we don't own land, and the state cannot own land. When the Bolsheviks said, no, this is a nationalization of land and property, and then we'll redistribute land according to different criteria. The peasant couldn't understand the language, couldn't understand. There were different grammars. And that was the beginning of a real friction between peasants and the Bolsheviks. I think that maybe that could be avoided, maybe. But instead of avoiding that conflict, what happened was an escalation. And the civil war with the peasants was really brutal in Russia, was extremely brutal. So that was a problem. And again, you know, when you, I don't know if this is Marx the materialist or the idealist, but you know, when you think in terms of a nationalization of property, basically state property, you are, again, you are back in the Western categories. Western categories can comprehend both private and state properties. Not to, actually, they are two sides of the same thing. They work according to the same logic. And I think that idea of a nationalization was already a way to go back into the Western path, I think. But then, to your point, I have two short answers. The first one is, yeah, maybe you are right. Under attack is very little that you can do. And if we consider the Zapatistas in Chiapas, in a certain way they are lucky because the Mexican government, okay, there was an initial conflict, almost a war, but then they stopped taking care of them. They just, the Mexican government almost ignores what they are doing. So in a certain way, these experiments are possible when the state is taking a nap or when the state is withdrawing. And then you have these things. Maybe. I'm saying that because the problem we are facing today is that our modern states are really extremely powerful machines of repression. You know, I can barely think of a kind of a real conflict or internal civil war with these machines, which are built in order to neutralize conflict or in order to repress conflict. It's almost impossible, I think, you know, and therefore I tried, and this is how I read these experiments, even the Russian experiments today. I tried to find, okay, is there another way to go that instead of facing a conflict with the state, goes somewhere else and try to build an alternative within the state or what is left of the state today. Because in a certain way, we can even think, I'm now thinking out loud, it's not in my book, but maybe if there is something interesting that neoliberalist policy have done, is that they reconfigure so many functions of the state. In a certain way, the state, if the state is less present, is something that we can use it. It's something that we can take advantage of the fact that the state is less present. So again, there are two ways to go. Oh, we need more state because we need a welfare state and we need more state intervention. Okay, yes, I understand that point. Especially now with the coronavirus, we need a real efficient health system. We need more state. But at the same time, I said, okay, if the state is reconfiguring its own function in a way that is less present at the level of society, that opens up room for social practices. Let's organize ourselves in a way that we don't need the state. In a way that indigenous people in Cochabamba did with water. They don't need the state to build infrastructures. They built their own infrastructures, and they say to the state, go away, we don't need you. So I think we need to relearn how to take advantage from the conjuncture in which we live without looking back. Oh, the state is withdrawing, we need more state, we need more welfare state. No, maybe there is another way to go. I think a third possibility is always open, and is a part of our task and capacity to imagine this third possibility that we have to pursue.
Well, on that note, it's a perfect time to open up to the floor. There's a ton of questions. Why don't we start out with Daniel Cunningham? Go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
Hey, thanks. Sorry. Thanks to both of you and everyone. So I think my question relates to this sort of political antinomy that has structured a lot of this so far. And I am trying to kind of make some more sense for myself of, you know, this antinomy, I think is a word. Just it never seems to go away between, you know, more anarchistic decentralization and strategy, communistic centralization, etc. But on a sort of different note, more particular to your work, I guess, you said, answering a question that I specifically had earlier when you were talking, that yes, temporalities are plural, temporality is plural, but there is always, you said, one dominant temporality. And you've made very clear what the characteristics of the one that we have is and has been. So I guess my question is, in the future that you're envisioning coming out of all of this, and fastening all of these kind of utopian energies that you find in the past, and in the future that you envision, is that still true? Or is there something like more of an empowerment of intersecting and plural temporalities? Or, and I think this does relate directly to more the kind of pragmatic political strategy that we've been talking about, does a sort of social or human temporality need to be imposed? What are its characteristics, and how does that happen, if that's your view? Thanks.
Okay, Gabriel, how do you want to proceed? Should I answer, or you want to collect a few questions?
Well, I think we can start by, if you want to answer one by one, but there's a ton of questions, so feel free to, if you want to, you know, develop your responses later in response to earlier questions and whatnot, that's fine. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah. So yes, as I said, I think there is a dominant temporality, and then again, there are two ways to go, maybe more than two, but let me simplify. So on the one hand, you can think that the dominant temporality, let's call it, you know, the temporality of commodities, capital, that is a kind of a abstract time. If that time becomes so dominant that basically even difference in terms of quality are really actually subsumed in that abstract temporality. Because I think one of the forces of a capitalism is the fact that it is so abstract, that is indifferent to differences. And for that reason, you can have a proliferation of differences in capitalism. And these differences basically do not make any difference. Okay, this is the kind of a postmodern picture. But it's a picture in which that temporality is just the real dominant one, is absolute, is a totality. It's possible to go that way. I think politically, I think Tony Negri is going that way, in which subsumption, real subsumption is really a total form of subsumption. There is nothing outside capitalism. What I'm saying is, okay,
maybe there is nothing outside of capitalism. I can even agree with that. But there are, as I say, there are other temporalities which resist to that attempt of a synchronization. It's very clear in different parts of the world. So I think Cochabamba was that. Standing Rock was the same thing. Zapatistas was the same thing. So you can look around and you can see how people try to reactivate traditions, different relationship with the land and territory, in order to resist the dominant temporality, in order to reconfigure their forms of a social togetherness. But this is mainly a conflict of a temporality. In the West, unfortunately, I think it's the right wing that is taking advantage of the coexistence of different temporalities. What, you know, even the idea of a, I don't know if it is an idea, it's not an idea, of making America great again. Is basically what? Is the fact that you are addressing this slogan to a part of the population which think that the present is a hell, is untenable. The future can be even worse. And in a certain way, the only available temporality is the past. Let's make America great again. And for that people, there is something in the past that is appealing, because they can have some sense of identity, very often terrible forms of identity, being white, racist identities, but tradition, families. So in the language of the conservative, you have an attempt to use these forms of these other temporalities as a form of resistance against globalization, against financial capitalism. Everything is so full of contradictions that you don't see any way out. But the point is that we are still playing with these temporalities. And my point, my humble point is I think that today the right wing and the populists are able to use these differences and the conflict of temporalities much better than the left. And we are leaving them the monopoly of what we can call past traditions and customs. They are using that, and we are not. Because I think part of the left is still obsessed with the idea of a progress, with the idea that conflict can only happen at the level of the most developed form of a capitalism. And this is my problem with the Negri. Negri has the idea of a total subsumption, but then take a look. For Negri, conflict can only happen at the level of the most developed form of capitalism. And he has no hesitation to say that other conflicts are kind of a residual. He said that, you know, working class conflict is in comparison to cognitive workers, what the peasants were in comparison to the workers in the 19th century. So he's still an historicist. And even the idea of a total subsumption is historicist, because you see the trend, and you try to even to anticipate the trend in order to organize political intervention. My idea is different. You don't need to anticipate the trend in order to have a political intervention. You have it's very Benjaminian, my idea. You have a political intervention in the now, and what you have to do in the now is a kind of a understanding of the tension among strata and times that you have in your now, in your present. This is just two different ways to go and to put it. But I think my I don't know, it's not a suggestion, but my point is that let's try to think a form of understanding. Is there a dominant temporality? Is the dominant temporality absolute or not? And so on, from the perspective of the political implication of our understanding of the present. I think this is the message that is contained in the last thesis on Feuerbach. It's not that first we understand and then we try to change the world. Let's try to understand things from the perspective of a possible change of the world. So is the perspective of changing things that should orient our understanding of things, and not the other way around. If we have a very good picture of the existing world, we can change it. I don't think so, right? Because there is no such a thing as an objective picture of the world. I don't know if I answered.
Esteban, you're up next. If anybody, Daniel, or later on in the conversation, if anybody wants to jump in with a follow-up or pushback, then by all means, just unmute yourselves and do so. It did make me think, Max, that you might be a fan of the leftist slogan that is also temporal. It's not make America great again, it's make Israel Palestine again. But I'll just throw that in as a passing comment. Esteban, you're up next.
Okay, thanks. Hi all, and many thanks for the conversation. It's really interesting. And well, my question is also about temporality. So what you have, what you just said helped me a lot. But however, I would like to know if you could say something more about the nature of this these different temporalities, and considering that, well, if the dominant one imposes somehow linearity, yeah, maybe, well, there is a vision of these diverse temporalities that is also linear. So we have just a bunch of linear temporalities. They are diverse. They constitute a network, but in the end, they're also linear. And considering that, well, could you also say, yeah, I have a problem. I have a question also about, well, this dominant temporality that is, well, based on capitalism, and that in that sense must involve well, the contradictions inherent to capitalist ways of production, but also tries to synchronize. So is it does it have to be an incoherent or contradictory way of synchronizing, maybe in the sense of these interventions, I mean, power? It's just synchronization through power, not some logical synchronization. So thanks again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as you all know, the capitalist mode of production is a tricky, contradictory thing, and so it synchronizes, and at the same time, it produces and keeps differences. What does it mean? It means that, as I say, the socially necessary labor time is the normative time of a valorization. You know, so Marx, if Marx was correct, let's assume Marx was correct, socially necessary labor time is the normative time that defines the value that is objectified in a commodity. It's not the amount of time you spend in order to produce this cup of coffee, but it's the socially necessary labor time that becomes value, okay? So if I spend 3 hours because I don't have technologies, I don't have a machine, but the average of society's socially necessary labor time can produce this cup in 1 hour, the value that is objectified in this cup of coffee is 1 hour and not 3 hours, the time I spend as a particular individual producer, okay? So the point is that this is the synchronizing force of capitalism. Basically, the only way I have to be competitive at the level of the world market is to have a machine, to pay less my workers, to increase productivity, and so on. And this is the synchronizing force. But at the same time, capitalism loves that gap. Why? Because when you go at the level of the world market, my cap 3 hours time and your cap 1 hour time are the same, correct? So basically, I give you a kind of silly example, but if I exchange these caps, because the value that is objectified is the same, is 1 hour, what I can get is that I can exchange 1 hour of my time, or even less. I am super fast. I can produce things in 1 cup in 30 minutes, okay? Because I have technology. The point is, I can exchange 30 minutes with the 3 hours, okay? What is the point? The point is that there is what you have, what the Marx called extra surplus value. So basically, high-tech producer can take advantage of the fact that they use technologies in order to take social surplus value from society, from the fact that other producers spend more time to produce the same thing. Okay, maybe it's a little bit complicated, but not so much. The point is, if you want to keep that advantage, you need the differences. So capitalism works both ways. On the one hand, synchronizes. On the other way, capitalism wants or loves to keep that differences. So basically, it doesn't want to spread out technologies, because otherwise, you don't have the advantage of being in Silicon Valley. Okay, you don't have the advantage of producing this cup in 30 minutes because everybody else can produce the same cup in 30 minutes. The advantage you have, and that Marx called extra surplus value, is only possible because of these differences. So this is maybe the, in my opinion, this is the objection that we can address to people who think that the capitalism today is a kind of a homogenizing force in the global market. No, it's not true. It cannot be. That could be a kind of an entropic non-return point for capitalism if the global market can be homogenized. Capitalism has to keep and preserve differences, sometimes with violence, sometimes with wars, colonialism, imperialism. There are many, so basically it requires the intervention of the state in order to keep these differences. But these differences can play an interesting role because it's there that you have different temporalities. It's there that you have conflict and tension between different temporalities. So the capitalist mode of production works both ways. It synchronizes, but at the same time, it cannot totally, entirely, completely synchronize. And as we have learned, we can only take advantage of some internal contradiction in this system. Basically, maybe I relocate the contradiction at the level of time, but I think it's not so far from what Marx had in mind. Maybe the only difference is that maybe what I'm trying to think is more suitable to our colonial world, so or world market and world capitalism. So it's not something that is that has been taught just at the level of Western capitalism or high-tech capitalism. Is what I try to do, especially in the book on Marx temporalities, is to consider capitalism as a form, as an economic form at the level of the entire planet and world market.
That's really interesting. It didn't come out as trenchantly in Insurgent Universality, but what you seem to be suggesting is that then the temporality of capitalism is that it doesn't only produce this productivist unilinear time, but it also produces structural underdevelopment, primitive accumulation, and other such things. And so it's actually producing its own stratified temporality, right? It's creating so-called backwards countries, underdeveloped countries, and other such things. So it's interesting to hear you think through Insurgent Universality from that perspective. If it's okay with everyone, since there are so many questions, maybe we can start taking two at a time. Max, is that okay with you?
It's fine.
Okay. And Scott, I believe you're up next.
Thanks. I really love this discussion. There's a couple things. One thing I really like the way that you talked about the way of like avoiding or neutralizing conflict, because when you think about that as politics on the state level and how that comes down to interpersonal level, I think that that's like the work that's being done in a lot of transformative justice prison abolition movement is to like think about how to engage in conflict between each other. The thing that I want to sort of, I guess, I want to think about conflict in time. This idea of the way that you talk about temporality, I think, is really helpful, and like citing in these different moments of conflict with the state, and thinking about revolution maybe not as a punctual moment, but like this kind of avoiding of a conflict. But in those moments of conflict, I'm wondering what you think about a temporality that's like not lasting or that is like dissolving. So rather than think about like these protest movements of like not getting anywhere because they don't like get the concessions or the demands that they're making of the state, or they don't like win in some way, the thing that happens is that event in the streets, like between the people, which I guess is sort of like citational in the way that you're talking about it. So I'm basically asking what you think about like a temporality that doesn't project like a timelessness or an endlessness, or like that is open to dissolution.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And Yeta, could you share your question as well?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And thanks everyone for letting me join the session today. It's been a pleasure. So I have a question kind of related to the response to Esteban's question. A lot of, or a few actually, Marxists will relate the contradictions within, or the main contradiction of capitalism to be between value and wealth. And that contradiction seems to me to get to this discussion of different forms of temporality being generated not by the process of production itself. And so the question that I have is, what is the relationship?
I'm sorry, Yeta, you just froze right after you said there was a contradiction between value and wealth.
Oh, okay. So let me repeat myself. So for people like Poisson and others, the main contradiction is between value and wealth. And that seems to be a contradiction which has to do with the differences of temporality, but one that's generated from the production itself, right? And so this has to do with what you were talking about earlier, abstract labor time, right? So when you have obviously here the measure of value is very different from concrete labor. However, because it has to do with productivity, the increase or decrease of a socially necessary labor time is always related to a different kind of temporality, which is concrete labor. So Poisson, I think, articulates this very well, right? But for him, the difference between production of value and wealth is generated, this contradiction is generated from the production process of capital itself. And so my question is, what do we make of this as a kind of different temporalities being generated from within the production process versus what you were talking about earlier as dominant and non-dominant temporalities? Is that an external kind of temporality that's being generated not from the production process itself, or are they related at all?
Mm-hmm.
Great, Max.
Yeah. 1 second, I need to take note, otherwise I forget the question. Yeah. So I think maybe the first question, Scott's question, thank you. Thank you, Scott, for your question. I would say, so I think there is a, I think we can think a revolution or a revolutionary event in terms of, event, as Badiou is talking of event. So something that can happen suddenly and something that has a very specific duration. So I think my problem, I love Badiou, but my problem with Badiou is that for him, the concept, the idea of event is that is always something limited, something that can happen and something that ends. I have a different problem. My problem is events happen. How can they last? And again, my answer is not theoretical. I think, but you cannot find an answer because it's too theoretical and not historical. If you dig in history, you can see that that was the problem for all these revolutionaries. So one of the important issue in the Paris Commune was we needed to create institutions. Okay, then they were crushed, military. But their problem is that how is possible to create institutions which can last. So the problem is that we need a different practice of institution, in which institutions are not just the intervention or the product of the state. There are social institutions. We need to understand society differently. Again, if we go into the dominant canon of political theory, society looks like a kind of a space populated by atomized individuals, which usually are in conflict with each other, and therefore they need a big institution, the state, to regulate their conflict. That society doesn't exist. Society, or it exists as a product of the state. The state individualizes and atomizes society, but society is already full of groups and institutions. So in a certain way, for that reason, the language of the communards, the language of the workers in 1919 Germany's revolution, the language of the Zapatistas, and the language of the diggers in the English Revolution was always kind of a both and a little bit ambiguous between revolution and restoration. Restoration is another term that we have to claim. It is our term. The conservative, they stole the term restoration from us. It's our. Thomas Münzer talked about restoration. Winstanley is all about restoration. Landauer is all about restoration. What do you restore? You restore society as a social fabric full of institutions. And you restore from deeper layers of society is other forms, other institutions. The communards said we need to restore the imperative mandate from the Middle Ages. In the first draft of the Constitution in Germany in 1919, they say we needed to restore the communal freedom from Middle Ages. They were not afraid of citing Middle Ages as a possible source of emancipation liberation. Because for them, it's not going back to feudalism, is how, if you really break teleology, Middle Ages looks like a huge arsenal full of juridical, political, and economical practices that you can reconfigure in the present. And it looks like something that is not a pre-modern. This is teleology. It's not a Middle Ages is not a pre-modern. Middle Ages is a non-modern. And for that reason, because it's a non-modern, non-capitalist, non-state, can be used as an arsenal full of possibility to imagine a non-modern present and future. They did it. I'm not doing that as a theoretical experiment. I follow all these activists in these historical examples. They did it. But we feel uncomfortable because the teleological understanding of time is so deeply rooted in our mind that we feel uncomfortable when we think in terms of Middle Ages as a possibility to imagine non-modern futures. We can be a little bit more generous, and I think it's a kind of ethnocentrism when we see that the indigenous people are doing that. When they claim indigenous tradition in order to reinvent their future and the present, we are more okay with that. But we are not okay when we, the modern Western, try to do the same thing. This is a problem with our categories. You know, I think we should learn from indigenous people how to relativize our historical conception of the present. We have a lot to learn. So this is, so in a, I think to your point, I think we need to think in terms of a lasting institution in order to redefine an insurgency or a revolution as something that goes beyond a limited temporal event. At the same time, we need to recombine these two dimensions of the term revolution, that is revolution and restoration. And actually, it's just another semantic layer of the term revolution that originally was a circle. Revolution is the return of something. On the second question, this is really interesting. I would say, yes, I think there is something in the tension, conflict, contradiction between value and wealth. The way I like to put it is, and Marx also says that value as abstract value and the process of valorization destroys the real sources of wealth. Labor and land. In order to intensify valorization, capitalism exploits both labor power, human beings, and land. I think where there's a contradiction, there's a tension. So I think I have very little to say, actually. I think that today this contradiction is so clear and so evident. You know, the process of valorization is devastating the entire planet, and this is just another manifestation of the conflict between value and wealth. I mean, the real source of wealth. And this is where I want to go. And the other dimension that I think is not really considered in Poston, but is that another way to put it is the tension, the conflict between value and use value. And then if you point out the specific, what Marx calls the specific commodity that can valorize value, labor power, then basically that tension and that dualism between use value and value becomes the tension and the conflict between not only the use value of my labor, but the fact that that commodity, labor power, is attached to the real source of labor power, that is the body of the worker, the real workers. So in my opinion, and this is where I would locate my conflict of temporalities at the level of a production, is that there is a real conflict between the temporality of the life of workers, men and women, and even at the level of reproduction, but real bodies with the real needs and so on, and the abstract temporality of value and valorization. So in a certain way, what I want to say is that we have to reposition the centrality of the temporality of the bodies that is extremely concrete and extremely material. So my materialism is and this is how I read Marx, is the materialism of the bodies of the workers. Because almost 3/4 of Capital Volume 1 is about how these bodies are exploited. It's not just about the political, economical categories. Marx goes deep into this abode of production. And what he sees is how life, time, and bodies are destroyed. So this is just the other, I think we shouldn't forget this other side of the coin. When we are thinking about climate change and environment, is just the other side of the destruction of the other source of wealth, that is our bodies. And you don't need to have an old-fashioned factory in order to understand the destruction of bodies. I think bodies are destroyed every day by working in front of a screen for hours and so on, and at the end of the day, you have a terrible headache. At the end of the day, you just want to drink a couple of beers and you want to go sleep. This is, there is a form of distraction, of a psychological and physical distraction, even at the level of high technology. Now there are nice, interesting research on Silicon Valley about that, and again, what I like to do, and I would like to see a project, a work which addresses this thing, is how you have the entire chain of a value from Foxconn, where in China workers produce our computers, and Silicon Valley and back. So I want to see these two forms of a production combined, and how we can understand them only as a combination. And then I want to understand the forms of destruction of bodies and the human time in these forms of production. So this is how I like to address these kind of questions. My problem with the Postone is, in one word, there is too little room for real bodies in his work. But maybe I'm not generous enough, but that was my concern when I read Time, Labor, and Social Domination.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Max. I'm just going to note in passing, put a follow-up question for us to think about, but I also want us to be vigilant about time so that we don't have to drink more beers to make up for the amount of time we're on our computer today. The follow-up question was just about the danger of institutions coming from the ground up that are then co-opted by the state, or the state uses to outsource its labor in various ways. So I'll just plant that. If you'd like to respond to it in your kind of group together response, then do by all means. Otherwise, we have 4 questions left, and I think I'll cut off Stack if that's okay. Why don't we hear from Eli and Gustavo first, and then we'll have a response from Max. So Eli, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much, Gabriel, and thank you, Massimiliano, for this conversation. I have a question, I think, that goes sort of to the initial intervention of at least as far as I understand it, as to what Insurgent Universality is sort of trying to do. And then I also have another question, which is simply about sort of how you find yourself in relation to other folks who have thought about terms like multiverse and pluriverse. So I guess my first question is, I would like to press you to say a bit more about how we might substantiate the claim that any and all forms of sort of understanding time in a unilinear fashion is the word that's been used, but perhaps there are better synonyms, I'm not certain. Or rather sort of how we might say that in some straightforward sense, it is easily discernible that this is intrinsically colonialist is the term that I believe is the phrase that you used. This is, I mean, of course, others have made this claim, which brings me to my second sort of part of the question, which is, of course, the decolonial school of thought. This is a rather prominent strain of their thinking. I'm thinking of, you know, Arturo Escobar, Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossvogel. I mean, it's really the entire camp of decolonial thought that forwards, that sort of circumventing the opposition of universality and particularity can result in this multiversality, of which admittedly I am very skeptical. I must sort of give you a disclaimer that I'm sort of skeptical of this approach. But they also make a very similar claim that somehow the very logic of unilarity, if you will, I'm not actually sure if that's the adverbial form of that word, but that, right, sort of having a singular trajectory is the problem. And I find actually maybe this sort of speaks to the larger theme of some of our conversation, that this is a consequence of the fact that their sort of form of decolonization, or rather decoloniality, is so incredibly bent on an epistemic intervention. So I wonder if, in fact, it's actually not guilty of a bit of idealism. You know, oh, the problem with sort of colonial history is that it sort of proposes a singular trajectory, when in fact, I mean, I would say maybe the more prominent problem with colonial history is that it's, you know, that it sort of generates these sort of retroactive rationalizations, which are in fact, you know, ultimately nothing more than ideological coverings for violence, which frankly, you know, couldn't really reasonably be organized into such an artificial narrative. So on the one hand, I'm asking sort of how you situate yourself in relation to this decolonial school of thought, specifically, predominantly Latin American, of course, and sort of how you see multiverse in relation to the term multiverse and pluriversality in that tradition. And moreover, sort of what can you say, I think, to expand a bit on the claim that this is intrinsically colonialist? I would like to hear more about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great question. Gustavo, do you want to share yours as well?
Sure, mine is kind of related as well. So I have two questions. One is about, I haven't read your chapter of your first chapter of Insurgent Universality, but you mentioned the question of the Haitian Revolution, it seems. So I would like to, you know, you can please develop how do you engage between the relation between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, given that these were very like contemporaneous, but with very different objectives? And what does it say about questions of temporality and revolutions? That's my first question. The second question is just a clarification. It's a question of terminology. What do you mean by temporality? Is it a question of a different organization of time between past, present, and future? Do you mean a question of organizing history or histories? Do you mean questions of rhythms and pace of how time passes by? So I would like to know like what specifically you think about like the question of temporality. Those are my two questions.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Max.
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking how to give a short answer. Yes, because they are tough questions. So my relationship or how I read, or what is the difference between my work and post-colonial studies, I would say, yeah, it's in the title of the book maybe, and I don't want to use the word still. I think there is something in universality that is crucial for a political project. So I don't give up a universality. And I think there are many representative of post-colonial studies which just don't believe universalism can be used. In order to make a difference, I said, okay, it's a universality. What's the difference between universalism and universality? In one word, the difference is that the universalism is an assumption, and it starts with the idea there is something that the human share as an assumption, and then on that assumption you build a juridical construction. Oh, there is a human essence. We need to protect the humans. We need human rights, and so on. And you build. Or another way to think of universalism is a kind of expanding universalism. Oh, it's a kind of then it's even more colonial. Is a process, is a project of civilization. And if there are people who are not yet ready for democracy or other things, it's just because they are not yet ready. But universalism will reach them sooner or later. And there are other ways. So this is how universalism works. We can say more, but I think it's pretty clear. It's a dominant idea and Western idea. What is universality instead? I think this is the tricky thing. And usually people ask me, okay, we can understand insurgent, but we don't understand universality. So universality is, in my examples, it is an insurgency, and it is a kind of a suspension of the order. Is the moment in which an order has been suspended. And the meaning is that in that suspension of the order, pre-existing differentiation and hierarchies, family, patriarchy, classes, and so on, these differences and hierarchies has been suspended. And that opened up to a kind of a plurality of practices, which have something in common. And what they have in common is their attempt to dismantle the pre-existing order and to open up the possibility of something else. They share practices instead of sharing a common assumption that looks or sounds more metaphysical. They are just sharing practices. Again, an example, in the French Revolution and in the Paris Commune, there was not an attempt to enlarge legal citizenship by these insurgents. They said, look, we don't need a legal citizenship. Why? Because we are political citizens already in our everyday practice. This is the thing. You know, there is a kind of a political citizenship, political belonging that is rooted in practices which are open. Why are open? Because the only assumption is that the previous exclusion and hierarchies are suspended. So this is the moment in which something like a universality can happen, and actually it happened. I'm going now to Gustavo's question. It happened when both ways, the French insurgents and the people in San Domingo took seriously the French Revolution, but both ways. So what I want to say is not that the Enlightenment project of French culture and then French Revolution gave them the impulse to free themselves. Or I don't want to say that the articles against slavery in the first one is is Article 18, if I remember correctly, in the 1793 Declaration, is about is actually about slavery, because the article claims that it's not possible to sell and buy human beings. The point is, this article is not the result of French Enlightenment. My point is, this article is an attempt to incorporate into the juridical language of a declaration what was going on in the colonies. So the two events are strictly related, and they influenced each other. And then I'm going back for a second. Another difference between what I'm doing and maybe the post-colonial project, I can, maybe it sounds not so generous, but sometimes I have the impression, I'm under the impression that for some representative of a post-colonial studies that I respect and I learned a lot, but I am under the impression that for them, Europe is a kind of a monolithic thing, something that has to be thrown away, because the entire European project from Renaissance on is colonial. I have to say, frankly, that I deeply disagree. I disagree. Why? First, because the Renaissance was a mess of different cultural projects, and Renaissance was still open to different possibilities. It was not a piece of a monolithic culture. It was full of conflicting perspectives in which alchemy and astrology coexist with the new sciences and so on. It was a mess, but an interesting mess. I like messy things. And the second thing is more political. If you say that basically that Europe is a monolithic project, basically you are ignoring the internal colonialism within Europe. What about the diggers who were crushed during the English Revolution? What about the peasants, thousands of peasants in Germany crushed and killed by princesses and Luther because of their insurgency? What about the communards? So basically, by saying that, you kill these people once again. I'm not part of the game. You know, I think all these events were political attempt to reorient Western modernity in a different direction. But they were, or they had been colonized by the dominant temporality of Europe, state, capitalism, and so on, and they were killed. But they are something else, and their experiments were experiments to reorient modernity in a different ways. So back to Gustavo's question, this is how I think of different temporalities. So for me, there is the dominant temporality, the state, the capitalist project with its self-representation in terms of a culture, in terms of a dominant canon, from Hobbes to Hegel or John Rawls. And then there are these different layers and temporalities of all these kind of, all these insurgencies, all these attempts to readdress modernities in a different way. And I call them temporalities because, not just because their pace is different, but because if we want to use the image of many unilinear times, they represent other possible trajectories. maybe I can say, I don't know if it is accurate, I have to think about that, that I can use the term, sometimes at least I use the term temporality as a temporal trajectory. So there are different temporal trajectories, and the point is that they coexist in the present in the form of legacies, traditions, and so on. And in the present, there is a tension between them. And what we can say and what we can do with this tension is to develop it, to use it in order to open up possibilities. So we cannot redo the commune, but we can, and this is Benjaminian, we can try to achieve today what was not possible at the time of the Paris Commune. So we can try to complete that interrupted project. That is the project of the internal colonized of Europe. And they have a lot in common with other colonized people, a lot of common. Even their forms of a self-organized self-government, their form of a communal possession, they have a lot of things in common. So we can, and it's not, I'm saying that because I don't wanna, I found myself sometimes at the corner in which I think, okay, what they have in common, the European colonized and the other colonized people, is their common opposition to the dominant temporality. I wanna try, and I need help to do that, I want to try to think that what they have in common is not just an opposition, because this is still stuck in a kind of a binary scheme. They have in common that they should have, or I want to think they can have something in common that is more than an opposition.
There's a lot more. This is a great conversation. I'd love to continue it, but just in the interest of managing time, we have two final questions. Apologies in advance. We'll obviously go 10 or 15 minutes over, but let's hear from Dragana first.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for this great conversation and lecture. I will be quick. I'm wondering what is your position or some thoughts about when we talk about these historical examples. What's your thought about Yugoslav experiment and the so-called third way of Yugoslav socialism? So, you know, when the Yugoslav communists turned their backs on Moscow in 1948, and when Yugoslavia became the classic example of socialist country successfully breaking with Stalinism. And regarding that, what's your thought about local people's councils, revolutionary administrative bodies, which had arisen during the World War II to support the partisan movement, regarding this example with local Soviet? And also, what's your thoughts about workers' self-management, which was introduced in Yugoslavia during the 50s? That self-management system was and still a subject of controversy in my country. So I'm I would really like to hear what are your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dragana. And then Danish, you'll have the last question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Professor Max. I'll keep it brief. In a sense, you touched upon, I mean, you partially responded to the question that I had, and it's to do with the post-colonial experience in India, or to invoke the phrase that the societies that have been relegated to the waiting room of history, Dipesh Chakravarti's phrase that he uses to talk about post-colonial societies. I mean, on the one hand, you have delineated the idea of recovery or recuperation of certain tradition as something which still remains bound within the Unilinear idea of temporality. So this is something which post-colonial scholars or post-colonial studies terms as nativism. So even in your rejection of nativism, how are we to make sense of certain traditions and practices And bearing in mind that India is a very diverse society. So with that diversity of traditions in mind, I'm thinking that could it be that we also have a certain categorization between irrational temporality and rational temporality, besides the dominant temporality that you have been talking about. So I'm saying this because a lot of, by way of illustrating, a lot of these everyday practices, for example, the idea of tolerance, even as modern state demands of you to be tolerant, the resource of tolerance for a lot of Indians would be an ethical norm rather than a political ideology. You know what I'm saying? So I'm wondering if you would like to throw some light on, let's say, a religious inspired temporality or a psychic time that people inhabit, and they draw their resources of experience from therein. Thank you.
Yeah.
Max, what's yours?
Yeah. Yeah. On Dragan, on Yugoslavia, I know I'm ashamed to say that I don't know so much, and I should be really ashamed for two reasons. One, why? Because yes, that was a very important experiment, but the real reason, in my opinion, is biographical, because I was born almost at the border with the Yugoslavia in Friuli, that region, at the border with what is now to Slovenia. And maybe because it was so close, we were not so interested. I don't know. But something, yeah. But it's true that recently I'm having more and more conversation about the experience and the experiments in Yugoslavia, and sooner or later I wanna work on that and try to understand more about that. I can only say one thing, that it's just in my memory. It's not a recent thought about Yugoslavia, but maybe it was a kind of a ready-made criticism that we had when we were young on the left and in Italy, and was the criticism about workers' self-management. And we thought, yes, but it's very easy that self-management can become self-exploitation, because you know, reading Marx and you understand that the problem is not the presence, the physical presence of the capitalist as a persona. The problem is the mechanism of valorization. The problem is when you start producing commodities from the market, is at that point that the socially necessary labor time becomes normative. So you can even have a self-management and you can make a decision about your working day and what you produce. But if you are subjugated to that normative time of a socially necessary labor time, basically your freedom is the freedom to exploit yourself. That was my thought 30 years ago. I'm pretty sure that if I reconsider Yugoslavia now, I will see things differently. But I can only tell you, I'm interested and I want to learn more. I cannot say, more than that. And thank you for your answer, because it's just another, together with what other people told me, it convinces me that it's time to reconsider that history. Thank you. The other question, I don't think there is and if I understand you, you don't think either, there is a difference between rational or irrational time. So the game we are playing is to challenge a binary opposition. So rational, irrational is another binary that we want to change. And for that reason, especially if we consider religion on the side of something that is irrational, I would say no. Religion, theology, the Bible was a battlefield for people like Winstanley, the Diggers, and Thomas Münzer was a priest for the German peasants insurgency, for Wilhelm Weitling, socialist before Marx. They used the Bible in order to claim common property, in order to claim equality, and so on. So the interesting thing is, in my opinion, when you use a religion, the Bible, and what you are basically doing in all these examples, you are activating a different authority in order to legitimize and to gain force for your social practice. You are claiming a different authority that immediately is in conflict with the dominant power. And I think again is a matter of temporality. Just they work with a different grammar. So the temporality, the religious temporality, is a temporality that gives you a tradition and an authority to challenge the dominant one. I give you another example. I could go to India with the Chakrabarti and make the example that he made about that insurgency resistance that was organized when the local shaman said that God told him to resist. And then the question is this rational or irrational? Does God or gods exist or not? No, the point is, yes, they exist to the extent that the implication, or they have agency to the extent that their implication of what the shaman said is a political implication. It activates agency, people agency. Today you can have a similar thing when this is very, very recent, and especially common in the US more than Europe actually, is the tradition or the practice of the sanctuary. And the thing is, what they activate is the authority of the Bible, is a religious authority, the authority of the church. Usually in the US, they are Quakers. And they use that authority in order to challenge the power of the state. It's about migration. It's about give them hospitality, sanctuary. And I wrote a piece about that. I can share with you if you want. And this is a very interesting thing, because it's another way to challenge the binary, because the language of many activists of sanctuary is not the language of a disobedience. Oh, we disobey state law because we think that the law on migration are unjust. They claim something different that they call civil initiative, civil initiative. But the point is that they say that it's not about disobedience, but it's about obedience. It's about obedience to a different authority. Religious authority, the Bible, the tradition of the church, and so on. And that makes things more, I think, in my opinion, extremely interesting. Because you introduce this gap and tension between the power of the state and an authority that the state cannot recognize. And there's in my article is the beginning, the first page, the beginning of my article is about a trial against these activists, sanctuary activists. And this is so interesting because the prosecutor couldn't understand their language because of their claim of being obedient to another authority. From the point of view of the state, there is no such a thing as another authority. So yeah, that's it. I hope, yeah.
Great. Well, on that note, I think it's a perfect moment to wrap up. It's very hard to thank people over Zoom, but thank you very much, Massimiliano. We'll applaud here, at least virtually. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And thank all of you for the wonderful questions. So take care. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, all of you.